Good evening, everyone. My name is Sasha Weinrich. I am a member of the North Andover SEPAC Executive Committee. We are so happy to have everyone here and to have Urban Collaborative here. I just, before we get started, wanted to repeat again that if you would like to ask a question anonymously, please use our Google spreadsheet. I will put the link in the chat. This is recorded and is public. So if you have anything you do not want on the record, please use that Google spreadsheet. Please also know we're here as a Q&A for Urban Collaborative, and questions specifically about your own child are probably not, this is not the appropriate forum for that. But we are really looking forward to this presentation, to asking questions, and would like to turn over to the Executive Director of Special Education, Marcy Bacuzzi. Thank you.
Thanks, Sasha. So I'll introduce Lauren. And Lauren, I see Carrie and Ruchika here. I think are those your team members joining us tonight?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll introduce Lauren again. Lauren and her team joined us Thursday night school committee meeting. Lauren works for Urban Collaborative. She's the executive director of Urban Collaborative. She has done reviews like this. Collaborated with Tom Hare, the late Tom Hare, who was one of the leading advocates in disability rights, not just in this state, but in this country. So she has conducted reviews similar to this in large urban districts. She herself has been an assistant superintendent in New York City and in New Jersey, a director of special education. She is an author. And holds many degrees in policy and special education. So she and her team have done a lot of work in helping us develop some background, and she can go over some of the pieces of the team's data collection. But we are have been going through this process since November with an eye towards really improving the outcomes of our special education students. So just that is the ultimate goal. We have looked at a lot of the data. We have now just all received the report. So in terms of what our department is doing, we're going to spend some time at PD reviewing. Our teachers are going to have to take some time for PD. So we're all looking at this week. And we'll begin to take a deep dive more into it over the upcoming week. So I'm going to put it over to Lauren and let her get started. Today, again, she's going to probably do just a very brief overview, but we really want to spend the time focused on some questions and any clarifications if people need them. So thank you.
Thanks, Marcy. And great to see we have 30 people here. I love this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest. And I know that the students in North Andover are well taken care of for families to show up. So thank you. And we do hope, like Marcy said, that we will share with you an overview of the presentation. I'll go deep dive in a few places, which I'll describe in a second. But we definitely want to make sure we answer your questions as best we can. They may be, if you ask a question and we know it's coming up, we may just say it's coming up. But please don't hesitate to ask. Don't hesitate to unmute and ask. So, like I said, our goal in this work is to share with the district from an external view what we see and what we recommend you do so you can move toward the ideal. You're in a fairly good place in a lot of ways, and you have a lot of work to do in a lot of ways, just like almost every other district. There is no district that is perfect, and no district that doesn't need to be improved somewhat. Though what I'm going to do today is share the big picture, go into depth with several sub-recommendations, and then we're going to look at some data and resources and leave space for questions. But again, if you have any questions as we're going through, please don't hesitate, because this is for you to help your students, your children. So we want to make sure that you get what you need out of it.
Lauren, can I just ask, what's the best way, just so I'm not, is there like a hand raise feature on the Zoom, or do you want people to put it in the chat and someone to read them out to you? What's the easiest way to do that?
I can't see all the hands. Carrie and Ruchika can, but I would say put your hand up and we'll see that. Unmute and we'll see that. Write it in the chat. Any way that makes sense for you.
Okay.
Is that okay, Carrie? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll keep track of chat and hand raising, and if you're feeling totally ignored, just keep pushing, and I'll keep looking to make sure I'm seeing people.
Okay, thank you.
And you've all received the full report, but we've pulled something out so we can actually share with you what I just said, the overview, etc. So you'll see on the bottom right, you'll see it says slide 1. On each of the slides, you're going to have something, most of them are in red, this one's in white, that says the slide that corresponds to the main report. Because one of the beauties of giving a report in this type of a format is that you can pull pieces from it and share to particular audiences or for a particular time frame. So that's what we've done here, but you have more than we're going to share here. But we hope that we go over the main pieces. And then the other thing I wanted to say here, go back still, Richard. The other thing I wanted to say is, as we go into this, our focus is always that special ed is about assuring equity for students with disabilities. And our focus is always that all educators teach all students in any district. And I'll just preview for North Andover some of the things that we're suggesting that you work on, and then we'll go into depth or strengths and things to work on. So your data looks pretty good, but when you dig down a little bit into it, you want to look at the opportunities, and we're going to do some digging into some of your data. We will share with you, and some of you heard this Thursday night, that we want to suggest that you shift your MTSS focus to tier 3 being for anybody, tiers 1, 2, and 3 being for anybody, and tier 3 not being special ed. And we want to focus also on access to the general curriculum in the least restrictive environment for all students, regardless of their disability. And then also we're going to focus on, we suggest that you focus on a strong collaborative partnerships between gen ed and special ed. So that's just a verbal preview, but now we'll go on, Richka.
Lauren, I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second. When you go over MTSS, can you just give a little breakdown of what that is in terms of, which I think you may go into, but just go into it a little more for parents, so they, just in terms of what the tiers mean in terms of for all students.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep, definitely. All right, so just so you know how to look at this report, we're going to give you the process. We'll go over that pretty quickly, how the review is organized, but the recommendations are organized as the strategic plan in the district is organized. And we do that specifically because we want to make sure that special ed is not often a silo on its own, that special education is part of the school district, and that anything that happens in special ed must be addressed by the entire district. So our observations and recommendations are connected to North Andover's 3 objectives in their strategic plan. So we just want to make sure we explained that. And your appendix, you'll see recommendations at a glance, but we're going to pull those up for you right now. So we're going to go over all the recommendations first, and then we'll go into some depth. Also in your appendix, you have a lot of data, and we hope to have time to go through most of that. And you also have a lot of resources to help you think through the observations and recommendations that we provided. And you can see that little slide 2 on the side there. That's corresponding to the official formal doc. All right, we'll keep going. So again, our goal is to help you build the capacity to provide a high quality education to all your students with disabilities through equitable access to rigorous curriculum and strong professional practices. Again, some of that is North Andover language on purpose. And we are just making sure that we think about high academic standards, period, the end, for all students. This is our team. I'll let Ruchika and Carrie introduce themselves, and then I will introduce Maura and Catherine, who aren't here. Ruchika? You're muted.
Yeah, I have to stop sharing to say hi. Hi, all. I'm Ruchika Chopra. I'm currently and physically in New York City. I had the pleasure to come and visit some of your schools, meet some of you, and looking forward to getting some feedback from you and your questions.
Hi, I'm Carrie Parker. I've been doing district reviews with Lauren and her team for probably almost 20 years now. My area of expertise is multilingual learners and the intersection with disability. and also data. So I'll be talking with you about some of the in which we looked at the data for this review. Oftentimes I only am able to look at the data, but in this case, I was also able to come to district and do some of the site visits and the interviews and meet some of you, which is a wonderful way. It makes it much better. It makes it much more able for me to really understand the data when I've been to the community. So I was also able to be there last week with Lauren. So good to see you all again.
And then another person on our team is Maura Tynes, and she is the executive director or director of special education for the elementary schools in Newton. And Catherine Bennick is our project manager who made sure all of the trains ran on time for us. We'll keep going. So our vision, again, is that this is from your language, that North Andover Public Schools, with the support from our community, will provide a safe learning environment that cultivates a respectful community of engaged learners, et cetera, et cetera. Again, making sure that we're focusing everything we do and students with disabilities as part of the vision of the community. Keep going. So our thematic drivers, the way we come in, and I started to say this earlier, is that special education is about equity. It's always been built on an equity platform. And the goal of special ed is to level that playing field so students with disabilities can succeed as if they did not have a disability. You want to get rid of the barriers that around disability and make sure that students get either access or specially designed instruction that allows them to succeed as they would without a disability. And then the other thing we come into this saying is, in terms of district reform, in our opinion and in our experience, when special ed is done well, all students benefit. So special ed done well will raise the bar for the entire district, and we truly want you to think like that. Do this well, everybody benefits. Keep going. And I'll review process, and I'll go over this fairly quickly, but if anybody wants to, excuse me, I just have to do one other thing. If anybody wants to ask more questions about it, feel free. So we first came in and we did our project. We started our project and I have my notes. We had technical difficulties earlier, so I don't have my presenter view up. So I'm going to do this part. This is the only thing I needed the notes for the dates. So we started in September, and tell me if I'm wrong, anybody. And we did our site visit in November. We finished interviews mid-November. We had a draft report, January. And then we worked with the district to make sure that we were aligned to the district. Our recommendations and our observations are our observations and our recommendations. When we work with the district, it's to make sure that it's aligned and woven into everything that the district is doing. Our analysis included our interviews, our focus groups, observations, a survey that went out to families and staff, and we did a lot of student level data collection and analysis that Carrie will talk about later. And then now we're presenting to the stakeholder groups. We presented last week to the board, and now we're presenting to you. And so I will let Carrie take it from here.
Okay, thank you. So we're basically going to present data in 3 different ways tonight. In one way is looking at the distribution of students with disabilities, that is, who is identified as a student with disability. Another way is looking at the performance of the students with disabilities and how that compares with students without disabilities. And then a third way is thinking about the least restrictive environment, that is, to what degree is our students with disabilities educated in inclusive settings. So those are the 3 major categories that we're going to talk about. And so this first one is probably numbers that you're familiar with, that in North Andover, 21% of students are identified with disabilities. And that's similar to the state, but both the state and North Andover are higher than the country. Not something that North Andover necessarily needs to focus on, but it is interesting to think about what does that mean that North Andover has 21% of its students identified with disabilities. In the next slide, this is where we talk about performance, and had a really interesting conversation with the board, raising the question of why it is that we looked at MCAS scores in terms of success given the current conversations about MCAS and the current interest on the part of some people to actually have MCAS have less of a role in accountability in Massachusetts. So these are the data that we have that we're able to talk about. But as you and as the district as a whole decides the work that they want to do in response to this report, one of the big things that you will have to do is figure out how are you going to measure any change that you're hoping to see. And it may be that you decide that looking at MCAS scores is not the measure that you want. But it is worth looking, I think, despite all of that, a little bit, because while North Andover has some things that are really positive about it, one thing that stands out with these MCAS scores is that the gaps that are experienced across the state between those without disabilities and those with disabilities are also happening in North Andover. Each of the 4 bars represents a grade, grades 3 through 8 and grade 10. The 2 bars on the left, the darker bars, are North Andover students without disabilities and North Andover students with disabilities. Then the 2 bars to the right, the lighter blue ones, are Massachusetts students without disabilities and with disabilities. And so you can see the trend across. And in the next slide, we're looking at the same thing but mathematics, and the gaps are very similar. And but one thing that we did note, and I'll note again tonight, is that North Andover does seem to be doing something good around mathematics, and that's something that some other data in the district also shows. But I'm not sure that it shows it that much for students with disabilities. So again, I'm always thinking, how is it that the students with disabilities can have full access to the high quality instruction that is happening in other areas of the district? So I'm seeing a question right here. Yes, thank you very much, Zora. Yes, the goal is that students with and without disabilities should be reaching proficiency at similar rates. If the MCAS is not a good measure of that proficiency, then that's something to think about what kind of measure you want to use as a district. Right now, the measure that we have is the MCAS. Next. So I talked about the idea of identification. And so this is looking at breaking down identification a little bit. North Andover is a fairly small district, and so it's hard to break apart and look at all of the different groups of students because you end up getting very small cell sizes. And so we wanted to show this one because when you think about those students who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, recognizing that that also is something that is changing in Massachusetts, but these are data that I pulled from the state. 39% of students with disabilities in North Andover are eligible for free or reduced lunch. In comparison, 21% of students without disabilities are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So that indicates that there is a socioeconomic status difference between students with disabilities and students without disabilities, and there is no biological or neurological reason why that should be happening. So that's something to keep in mind as you're looking at how students are identified with disabilities in the district. And we'll do a little bit more of that later. And then finally, this is just a hint of something that if we have time, I'll go into in greater detail. And this is the educational environment. And what's really encouraging to see, and this is where when Lauren said that North Andover's numbers look good, if you look at that bottom set of full inclusion, that is where students spend more than 80% of their day in general education, North Andover is the light blue bar at the top, and North Andover is higher than Massachusetts or nationally. 73% of students spend more than 80% of the day in general education. So that's very encouraging, which led us to then say, what is happening in the general education classroom for those students, and how are they guaranteed the services that they need? And so that's one point. Another point that I'll mention is at the very top there, separate school or residential facility. North Andover is similar to the state, and both North Andover and the state are higher than nationally. And so we understand that that's something that the district is working on. We just wanted to note that that's a little bit different than the positive part at the bottom around full inclusion. So all of these pieces, the identification practices, the performance, and then the educational environment, we'll be talking about throughout this presentation and looking at it from different slices. And with that, I'll turn it back to Lauren.
All right, you can go one more. Okay, so what we're going to do now, unless there are any questions or clarifying questions, we'll go on to just give you an overview of all of the recommendations, and know that each recommendation, which we're not showing you yet, we'll get there, has a number of sub recommendations. And I'm sorry, each recommendation has sub recommendations, which you'll see, and then each sub recommendation has action items and action steps, and they also have supporting data. What I'm not showing you here yet are the action items or supporting data. I'm showing you the recommendations and the sub recommendations to start. So we'll go ahead, and you can skip this one. I already said this. Okay, so again, focusing on those three objectives of the district. The first one is equity for all students. And our overarching recommendation is to create a vision and supporting systems that focus the district on providing equitable access to the gen ed curriculum's rigorous academic standards for all North Andover students with disabilities. And in order to create this vision and supporting systems, first, you need to define what that vision is. So what is your vision of how students with disabilities are going to succeed? How is it clear in the strategic plan that you're creating or that has been created? So then the next piece, and we can talk about MTSS. Marcy suggested that I go into a little more depth with this. So what MTSS is, it's multi-tiered system of supports. The best way to describe it is to think in a triangle. And if you think in a triangle, that bottom is tier 1, the next is tier 2, and that top is tier 3. The idea behind that is everybody gets tier 1, and most students can succeed if tier 1 is done well. So if you're teaching students to read and you have a strong literacy program and most of the students are doing well with that literacy program, that's your tier 1. But we know no matter if there's a disability or not, some students need more support. So then you have those tiers of support. So you always build in, no matter who you're teaching, no matter what you're teaching, you build in these tiers of support. So tier 2 says that, all right, for this literacy program, some students need a little more support here. So we're going to create that little more support for this group of students or this smaller group of students. And then tier 3 says there's still some kids who didn't get it. And we're going to assume that there's still some kids who didn't get it. And we're going to assume we need even more targeted supports. That's your tier 3 that would be more unique and individualized supports. And so MTSS is kind of going across the country. Is there a standard or best practice? I can't see the whole thing. For how much support is provided at each level? No, there's not. It's the standard is one standard to think about is your tier 2 is kind of small groupish, that you want to make sure some kids who just need reinforcement of a skill or a topic or a theme, and your tier 3 is more individualized. You want to make sure also, I would suggest that all curricula has at least tier 2 built into it. So you have that at your ready, and tier 3 again is more individualized. You want to also, I guess another standard of best practice is within your MTSS system, you always want to have progress monitoring. So you're making sure you know who needs more supports and that it's extremely fluid. And there was a question here. What does it say? Can a special ed, I'm going to go back to the bottom. Sorry, I'm having technical issues. Can somebody read that question to me?
It just said, can a special education student receive MTSS?
So yes, so here's the thing. First, I'm gonna change the language. I'm gonna say student with disability. You always want to put the student before the disability, so they're not their disability. So a student with a disability, of course, MTSS, and that's going to be our recommendation. MTSS is for all students. Special education supports and services should be woven within your MTSS system. And any kid, it should be fluid, so kids go in and out of it. In and out, depending on the topic, depending on the day, if somebody's absent for a few days, or if somebody needs that support just because of their learning style, it's all in and out. And what What North Andover has done, and you're not alone, is that North Andover has made tier 3 special ed, and we want to say, don't do that. And the state says, don't do that. So we want to make sure that special ed is not a tier. Special ed are supports and services to students and to help teachers within all of this. And with MTSS, it's really your whole systems, instructional, support, your instruction, both academic and social emotional, go into this. Questions, does that make sense? Questions around that? I don't have my chat up. Let's see if I can pull it up. And Carrie put in the MTSS blueprint, exactly. The state does, your state, Massachusetts, does a really good job messaging MTSS. And so what we're saying in our sub-recommendation 1B is that MTSS should be for all students. And that you need to look at your Massachusetts blueprint, as it says here, to figure out how to do this well. I'm not saying you don't do it well. I'm saying it's kind of separate, and you want to make sure you're a fluid district. So kids with disabilities, kids without disabilities. MTSS will also, a student who's exceeding expectations someplace, you want to make sure that they get what they need as well. So it's tiered supports. And so we're suggesting that North Andover has to think differently around special ed through MTSS.
Can I add one
Yeah, of course.
additional, Lauren? So one thing we saw last week at the board meeting that there are new practices around the use of different benchmark assessments for identifying how students are doing, particularly around literacy. And that actually is a really good grounding for developing tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 instruction, as those benchmark assessments indicate which students may have not gotten sufficient instruction through tier 1 and may need and benefit from some tier 2 instruction in the general education classroom, and then eventually tier 3. And there was a general question asked earlier about trying to understand how these recommendations would actually look in concrete practice. And while the district is going to have to choose which of the recommendations they lead with, because you can't do everything all at once, they'll have to make some priorities. This is one where, in fact, there should be some very clear changes that in fact align with some of the changes that the district is already making. And so I think while some of the recommendations are a little bit esoteric in terms of like develop your vision, some of them are much more concrete in terms of recommendations to change the practice for students in the general education classroom.
And with the vision and all, I mean, you saw me change the language. You want to do all levels of things in terms of changing a district and in terms of changing systems, because language matters, structure matter, politics matter, money matter. It all matters, and you don't want to leave out any of it. So we're trying to give you that full picture. But yeah, the literacy stuff that the district is doing is really good. It's really good. We're impressed.
I have a question.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Can you say who you are when you're asking a question? Because I only see words.
Yes, absolutely. Sasha Weinrich. My question is related to this, but also generally related to this conversation, that many of the positive things that have been reported are surrounding literacy and our new literacy curriculum. But that was only implemented a few years ago, and the screener was only done in earnest in the last 6 months, right? So with appropriate tracking and that going home to families. So I guess my question then is, how does this impact middle school and high school students, and what do we need to be doing? Because after watching the presentation on Thursday, I felt like there is this gap in my understanding of how do we address the potential, deficiencies in having a balanced literacy curriculum for so many years for middle school and high school students, and then how does that impact MTSS?
So the way I think of that very, very hard to answer question is you have to change a system and you have to attend to individual children. And that is often a conflict with one another, but you need to do both. And so there are many, 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 many ways to do that. you can't not celebrate that the fact that you're moving forward with literacy, because that's really strong and it's powerful and you have to have that. At the same time, your 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders need support now. And so there has to be some processes and practices put in place to address both. You have
And-
to deal with the individual and the system at the same time, eating, chew gum at the same time.
And I just want to add, those same students, Sasha, that you bring up are the same students who were the most impacted in that same realm for early literacy during COVID too. So it's a conversation that we have a lot because it's we see it. I mean, we absolutely see it at the middle school and early high school level. For
And I
both,
guess-
we hypothesize both reasons, both reasons.
Absolutely, but we're seeing it's very impactful. So I guess that was the piece that some folks I spoke to also thought about. And, is there a way, and perhaps Urban Collaborative has some recommendations given that they're national, we're seeing things done specifically in states like Colorado or other states that are utilizing tutors or other avenues to support these students that were disproportionately impacted by COVID. And in our case, curriculum that wasn't perhaps evidence-based, and how, is there another recommendation that we could talk about? And maybe this is outside of the scope or we can have another conversation, but these are the things that I was thinking about after Thursday.
And Sasha, you're right to ask that question. And I'm going to say there's no one right answer to it. There are many ways that people have done this. I've seen one high school that completely shifted everything and everybody became a literacy instructor of some way, shape, or form. And their summer school became all about teaching kids to read. And they shifted the entire practice and made sure that their high schoolers were reading almost at grade level, if not at grade level or above, by the time they left. I've seen other places where the shift is in like types of scheduling where you can have a class at every day that's just that support class. We used to call, I forget what we used to call it when I was teaching, but there's that. So you make sure you attend to those kids in smaller groups. There's you use Wilson and Foundations. Wilson is a really good literacy program for older students who are having a difficult time decoding. You want to, older kids who are frustrated probably have some social emotional needs that are getting in the way of their learning as well because they're frustrated. So you want to pull in counselors, pull in those types of supports as well, have them sit down, say, what do they need? Some places have said, and this goes against what Massachusetts will tell you, but maybe you graduate in 5 years instead of 4. Let us help you. So there's just not one way, but I think finding the ways that are good for North Andover is really important. And my mentor, Ruchika's mentor, the person that Marcy talked about, Tom Hare, he used to always say, doing this well is rocket science. It's hard. I mean, the answers might be a simple idea, but doing it is not simple. Does that help? Marcy? No, not Marcy. Sasha?
Yes, thank you. And I just have a quick follow-up. Marcy, the Wilson instruction, the folks that we sent using ARPA funds to get Wilson certified, not just trained, did any of those include high school teachers or middle school teachers, or were those predominantly elementary school teachers?
No, we've done all. So equally as many in middle school and elementary school, and not as many in high school. But yes, we've trained elementary through high school.
And is that certified? Are they all certified, or is it just trained?
Nope,
Okay.
certified.
Thank you.
And there are other things. I mean, there's Wilson is a really intense, really intense program, intense training, lots of fidelity, which makes it really strong. But there are other less intensive programs also that could be used for quicker training. There's also a lot of ways to access literature, like Sonos, I think you just got. So there's a lot of pieces you can do similar to Wilson, but Wilson is wonderful, but also it's very small group. It gets to fewer kids than some of the other things get to. Is there another question there?
Rachel just asked about Wilson OG. It's not, so we've actually had a lot of conversation about the movement around the amount that we've done around Wilson. We actually had a discussion about shifting through, is it, what's the, is, I don't know, IMG? I am, yeah. I'm sorry.
MSC.
There it goes. Yeah, there you go. I'm like, it wasn't the
Oh.
name you just said, but it is that name. And I'm
And I
getting,
think the
I'm sorry.
research is clear for those kids at middle school and high school. Wilson is so labor intensive. Like to go that far back, the rate
Yep.
of Wilson, you will not graduate with any of those closed gaps. Just Words is a great secondary option because they had to package that and make money, right, to catch up. And it's a great secondary option. Do we know if we have Just Words in
Yeah,
the
we do.
district?
Yep.
Okay. And
Yeah.
then as far as that, so you are looking into the IMSC
We're
training.
looking into it, but on some of the feedback
Yeah.
that we've gotten is that people want to expand their repertoire because of what we're seeing the needs in the classroom, sort of beyond not beyond a phonics-based multisensory, to look at other programs that might complement those as well. That we've done a lot of diligence in terms of the training around it, but that's not solving all the problems. And it actually, that's good in terms of how we're implementing services in the C-Grid, but a lot of the conversation in it, you know, kind of piggybacks on a lot of the things that we're hearing through this review around becomes around serving students, and especially design instruction in the B-Grid. So that's part of our conversation that we're having with teachers. So
Exactly.
it just circulated that within the last couple of weeks, and that was some of the feedback that I got to that exact program.
There's a raised hand. Oh, the raised hand's gone. Okay. So again, moving forward, if that's okay. You need to define and be clear that the district understands the definition of what is special education. And again, it's a service. And when people spoke about special education, they spoke in terms of program. And you don't have as many programs as it sounded when we heard people, but the idea seems to be special ed is a program, but it's not. And again, your practices don't show most programs, but it's a service. People need to understand that it is a service. It's not a place, and it is the responsibility of all. It's not their kids or our kids, it's our kids. And then as you do this, you want to always continuously improve your referral and evaluation process. You always, there's new findings, there's new information, students change. And I can speak from my own my own experiences. I was classified as having a learning disability and ADHD. And when they knew more about ADHD, every time I do that with my fingers, I get these balloons. Anyway, so when they knew more about ADHD, the LD diagnosis came off. And so you learn more and more, and the tools get tighter and tighter. And also, to be very clear, most disability classifications are very subjective. And so you want to just hone your skills on a regular basis. So we're suggesting that as well. Okay.
Lauren, there's one more question about, did you find that there was confusion between placement and program? That is full inclusion versus partial versus sub-separate versus established exit and entrance criteria into programs?
We find that, sorry, that's my question. We find that a lot of parents, when they speak to us as CPAC members, are very not clear about the difference between those things. That at the back of their IEP is a placement page, and many parents will say to me, they're in the partial inclusion program. And when I look at their placement pages, it's, well, yeah, your child is partially included for part of the day, but parents are not understanding the difference between placement and then district established programming that they are saying that we have as an actual district. Did you find that there was confusion there?
We didn't hear about that confusion. We just mostly heard program. But I can imagine that confusion being there for families and for the staff. I mean, the IEP is kind of set up, the IEP system in Massachusetts is kind of set up to talk program in this B grid and C grid, language. So we did not hear people talking about special ed as a service. We heard people talking about Wilson sometimes as a service to special ed or to kids with disabilities, but that's about it. Everything else was program or place, or inclusion or not inclusion, but not what you were actually doing. Not that you're not doing things, it's just people didn't talk about that. So I think this new IEP system and the work that you're doing with family, or the work that this district is doing with families, and you as CPAC should get some clarity and some language around that and start messaging that to the families so they understand what special education is supposed to be. The
Lauren,
entrance
you
and
said,
exit, go ahead.
you said something really impactful, which I think will resonate with with the families here, and just in terms of, so if you were going to say it later on, I'm stealing your thunder, I don't know, but I can't stop thinking about it, which was, and I'll butcher your words a little bit. But it was something along the lines of, there's this thought process in special education that you have to earn your way into a general education classroom, when in reality, everyone has like all students are in a general education setting, and then the supports and the layers of support are what special education is. So again, the thought process of any student needing to earn their way into an inclusion classroom was a takeaway from me. Because I would think that, in sitting in a million meetings over my time in special education, that's probably a pretty common thought process around the thoughts of special education.
I apologize. I'm going to have to switch computers. I'm having some major difficulties, so I'm going to move over to this other computer, which is right here. And there we go. Can you still hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Let's see if I can get over here. And I don't have good background on this one, but let me just turn off the video here. Okay. So the question that you're asking is really, what is special education? And so people often start with the IEP, and the IEP ends up having these ideas in this place, but you really need to be thinking about all of these other things first. What does the child need? What supports and services do they need? And then where do they need them? So the first thing is, every child is officially a gen ed student. The law is very clear that a student is a student in gen ed, and anything that pulls them out of that gen ed program must be justified. And so in order to justify that, you need to say that this service, whatever the service is, can't be done effectively in a gen ed class. And if the service can be done effectively in the gen ed class, then that student should stay in the gen ed class with access, with accommodations. So the one example that I often use is a ninth grader reading on a second grade level. And this ninth grader is got a ninth grade brain, ninth grade body. He's in, or she is in, English and math and history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're reading on a second grade level. Their decoding is on a second grade level. You don't want to teach that kid to decode in front of their friends. That's embarrassing. It's not okay. It's not the skill that everybody else is learning. So at that point, you want to make sure that that's a place to pull a child out and to do it in another place that's just more appropriate. But for history and ELA and math, you want them to be in the gen ed class with access. So they stay there, and if there's a reason, you have to really work hard to find that reason that a child is quote unquote pulled out to be to receive some sort of an education. Zora?
Yeah, thank you for that example. I think that's a great one. If we talk specific to that example, I know one question I've heard from families is about, so let's say that scenario, a ninth grader who's reading significantly below grade level. I think you said second grade. I know that one of the bullet points, and I can't remember which slide it was on, was talking about IEP goals, and that the goals should be based on getting students to that grade level, to the grade level standard. So do you have any suggestions or thoughts for families about, what does that look like in this example? How do we work together, families, the schools, to kind of think about that goal setting collaboratively, and what does that look like?
I mean, the IEP meeting that happens at the end should be a culmination of a lot of conversations. It should not be, and it can be redone anytime you want, or anytime the team wants. But I just really think relationship building between the families and the staff and the student to figure out what is appropriate, what does that child need, Where do they need it with the understanding that you want them in gen ed as much as possible? The research is really clear that kids do better in the gen ed classroom. They get taught more, they have access to more high-level curriculum in the gen ed classroom. And so you have that conversation with the families. I don't know how else to describe it except remembering the I in IEP, it's individualized. What does my child, this student need? Let's brainstorm, let's figure it out. It's not supposed to be simple. If a kid has a disability, it's complex. And so we should treat it as complex, and we should make sure that we think through all the ideas we have to figure it out, and then rethink and try things and bring the student in as bring the student into the conversation, see what they need and they want. I don't know
We
if
also
that helped.
We
Go
also
ahead.
have a lot of we have a lot of conversations around standards-based goals and standards-based IEPs, which I don't, might be what in those situations, and not necessarily in the language-based situation you're bringing up, but in terms of our students with more significant needs, it's a struggle. You know what I mean? It's a struggle to have to make those connections sometimes. But again, as we go through this process, part of it is that they're spending a whole lot of their time with a parallel curriculum and not access to the high quality instruction, which Lauren and her team we'll go back to and we'll talk about again in terms of, again, probably one of the weaknesses that they saw through their observations.
Okay, we can keep moving on.
We have two more raised hands. Should we take these questions and then move on?
Yeah, sure.
So Sasha and then Rachel.
Sure, just to follow up to Zora's question, and based on your example of a ninth grader reading at a second grade level, I understand, and we obviously as CPAC promote collaboration between the district and our IEP teams and our families. But what do we do if, in Massachusetts, for example, the response to a student reading that far below grade level is, well, our goals only need to show 1 year's progress within that time. So if the goal is only required to show 1 year's progress, how do you actually get a student that's reading at a second grade level in ninth grade up to grade level?
Well, I'll say two things. The goal is often about the skill, right? So let's separate skill from comprehension for a second in reading. So decoding is a skill, understanding what's being read is comprehension. Kids with learning disabilities typically have much stronger comprehension than they do skill. So you don't want to delete one idea by creating another. You don't want to focus just on the skill. You want to focus on that access to that high level thinking. So that's one way to make sure that kids keep moving on. The other thing is that 1 year level should be a minimum. You can go higher, and depending on the intensity of the literacy instruction a kid is getting, they can go more than 1 year. So I think I don't know if it's a state rule that it's 1 year. Is that what you're saying?
It's a standard. It's at least 1 year's growth in 1 year's time. That's the standard.
I think the standard is there because so many kids weren't getting 1 year's growth in 1 year's time. And I think that probably came from the last Supreme Court case, the Andrew case, where they found that kids weren't improving by the goals and objectives on their IEPs, and they tried to make another layer of higher standard for it. So I think, I think that at least 1 year. I think the at least should be what's important. But given intensive instruction in literacy, you can improve more than 1 year. That's not unheard of. It's not impossible. And was there another question?
Rachel.
Hi, thank you. Staying with that least restrictive environment and that non-participation justification piece, I know deeper into the report, you talked a little bit about how parents are expressing that they feel they require neuropsychological evaluations right now. And you had a really great statement about it almost acts often, their recommendations are conversely the opposite of non-participation justification in least restrictive environment. Do you find that a lot of the neuropsychs tend to be pull-out heavy? How do parents rectify that thought if this is what their neuropsychologist is recommending with that continued access to the least restrictive environment? just your thoughts on, do you
This
see
is-
that? Is that a thing?
Well, I'm not talking about North Andover when I answer that, okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So, yeah, I see it as a thing across the country. I
Yeah.
think that neuropsychs are wonderful and important and have a very, very important place in this whole process. But they're not educators and they don't often know the research around the education. And they're often surprised to know the research around education. And so there's definitely confusion around that. And when I work with families, it's like, all right, I always say, your doctor's going to say this, I'm telling you this. And so to explain that is really confusing to families. But neuropsychs often talk, and others often talk about getting more intensive services, which isn't wrong. It's just not all day in a self-contained class. Get intensive services, but not all day in a self-contained class. So there's nuance that that unless you're in this field, you may not understand.
Yeah. So it's important, you would think, for parents to, they spend all this money on their neuropsychs, right? They invest thousands of dollars and none of them do it because they want to. They do it because they feel they have to for whatever reason. And that goes back to your comment about building relationships and trust, right? If you're going down that road, you probably feel like that is lacking. And I think what we have to kind of think about as CPAC and supporting our families is, how do they wrap their heads around that if all of a sudden their neuropsych comes back with, all this significant secret recommendation, but we also want to encourage those parents to be looking at that non-participation justification page. So just, putting that out there.
If you have a bunch of neuros that everybody uses, bring them together and have some literature, read together, learn some research together.
That's a really good idea.
Everybody's trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
People just don't necessarily know.
Yeah,
I don't think
that's
anybody's
actually a really
doing
good
the
idea.
wrong thing out here. So I used to do that with families too, and they didn't understand what I was, what somebody was saying about the child. It's like, all right, let's just sit down and think it through together. So let the neuros get some training.
That's a good thought. Yeah, because they are not necessarily always in the know about public school and where it's at. They have the standard list of recommendations based on that disability type category and those numbers. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Intensive is not a bad thing.
Yeah, right.
But how do you do that? Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Keep going. Oh, one computer is moving, one isn't. Okay. So again, in this focus on creating a vision and supporting systems, you want to make sure and look and create your policies, procedures, and structures. And you want to be very clear that they all map together. And they may or they may not. Some of them do, some of them don't, but you just want to be very clear that it's a full package. And then again, like Carrie was talking about earlier, you want to use your data. You want to use your data to look for gaps, look for issues that you might have, look for places that you want to focus. And Carrie's going to talk about this, but you have some small data numbers that you need to then dig into that won't necessarily show in the quantitative data. So use your data to make data-informed instructional decisions for the individual students, for the district itself. Okay. Moving on to objective 2. This is the consistent and rigorous curriculum. And we're saying to create equitable opportunities for North Andover Public School students with disabilities to receive and be successful with the district's gen ed curriculum's rigorous academic standards. And these 3 areas to focus on are access to the general curriculum, specially designed instruction, and least restrictive environment. That's special ed in a nutshell. You want to make sure you're providing access to the gen ed curriculum when needed, and that's your 9th grader getting access to the literature that's being read through audiobook or something, like the Sonos you just got. Specially designed instruction is that decoding teaching that's not on grade level, and least restrictive environment. In all ways possible, you want to do that in the gen ed class like we've been talking about. Rachel, I see your hand.
I was just going to say, this slide for me is just so impactful for parents to be looking at right now, because it really It sums up the biggest things that as a CPAC, we're really trying to support parents in understanding. These are such three key elements here to looking at your child's IEP, to sit in, in a team meeting and being able to use the language that is thrown at you here. These are all the acronyms right here, the UDL, the MTSS, the DCAP, specially designed instruction, research-based, least restrictive environment. And for parents on this call, I can't stress enough how critical it is for us to be delving deeper into these three key things here.
You might want to get a cheat sheet of all these acronyms too.
Yeah, it's actually something we should probably look into throwing up on our Facebook there. Just this slide I'm just saying this is a great slide. Thank you.
You're welcome. Want to go back a little bit one more time? Just go back. So again, within access, you want to focus on the MTSS we talked about. You want to focus on universal design for learning, and that's basically saying you're going to give, as you create your instruction, you're going to give options so students can access the curriculum. And you have something in the district called the DCAP, and it's a pretty strong document that you want to use that helps look at some of the accommodations that are thought through, but that's not a comprehensive list. There's no such thing as a comprehensive list of accommodations. Especially design instruction, again, is that literacy or math or, if a child needs a communication device, you want to create that with specially designed instruction. And then again, least restrictive environment is what we've been talking about with in the gen ed class. The least restrictive environment is the federal legal term for access, being in the gen ed class as much as possible. Your least restrictive environment is that 80% that Carrie was showing you before. And then it goes less restrictive. More restrictive, more restrictive, more restrictive. Okay, I'm ready.
And I just want to say just a piece of background. Part of the reason why this comes up all the time in discussions that we have when we talk about inclusion, and it's purposeful inclusion. I just want to clarify, it's not like as of, your next IEP meeting, if your child's in a sub-separate program and gets a lot of service, it's like, okay, well, we're going to move from A to Z. But we talk about inclusion in a very purposeful sort of way. And we talk the reason why it's continuing to come up in this is because all the research out there, all pieces of research out there are going to support the fact that students with special education needs, students with any needs, do make more progress in the least restrictive setting. So all the research states that, and to Lauren's point, and then so does everybody else benefit. So that's the research aspect behind it. So it's not just being said to be said because that's what they think or that's what we think. That's what the research states.
And it could be done poorly. You want to do it right.
Yeah.
It can be done poorly. And when I say it could be done poorly, that can look like the student who's included is sitting in the back of the room, not doing what everybody else is doing.
Exactly.
Or the special ed teacher, and we're going to talk about this, but the special ed teacher and the gen ed teacher need to collaborate. So whatever that kid needs, they're getting in the class. So there needs to be access within the class so that it's more of the adults working outside of the class to make sure that children get what they need in the class. And if that's not done, it can be really hard for a child to do that. So you want to make the environment, you want to do this well, but you want to really be careful about not waiting until you feel like you're completely ready. There's a saying in special ed, ready means never. So you want to do as much as you can, knowing there's no way to be perfect with this. And you're going to fall in some places, and that's okay. You just need to keep picking it up and moving forward. I see Sasha and Rachel with hands.
Sorry, can I think my only concern, Marcy, is the words purposeful inclusion. And the reason why I want to it really conversely goes against the opposite of what we were just saying about gen ed first.
Well, purposeful when I mean
more
I guess when I say purposeful,
pull out.
Purposeful, anything, when I say purposeful, I mean in our discussions. But
it is typically tied. Purposeful, meaningful inclusion. Like, I think those are just constantly linked together, right? We want it to be meaningful time. We want it to be purposeful time. Whereas I think when we're talking about overhauling and using DCAP and MTSS and all of that, isn't it more purposeful pullout? isn't it more, should we be removing this child, or could we be doing it in the B grid versus, like we said before, earning our way back in?
Mhm.
Is this the more purposeful time versus purposeful should be more restrictive? I am thinking this through and purposefully saying we cannot achieve this inclusion. It must be out. I just see that if we're really looking at the systemic change here coming from, which looks to be, regular ed first, is the way I read this whole review. Truly, is the implementation of UDL and DCAP. We're checking the boxes on those things that they exist, but then the purposefulness is everybody's in. Why do we have to come out? And if so, that's okay, right? That's purposeful thinking versus is it purposeful to go in? And that's just something like as we're thinking it all the way through this time, just kind of stays with me. Sorry.
There is some new language out there I can't remember what it says, but there's some new language that kind of mixes what you both said together.
I just got it. Rightful presence.
There it is. There's new language that's been out there is rightful presence. Can you describe what that means, Ruchika, what people are saying?
Sorry. Rightful presence is that all our students have like I think Rachel, you were saying that their right is to be present in that environment, and they're not fighting for that right. They're not asking for that right. That's their rightful presence, and they're there in every situation. They're there in every environment, and therefore need the supports, which might lead to purposeful. And I want to say exclusion, but not really, purposeful movement to a separate location if necessary. So rightful presence is the new term that people are speaking about.
And it's not just kids with disabilities who might need that something else. It should be fluid for kids to come in and out. A kid's absent for a week, or a child really needs to push. Sorry, I'm just reading something. Do we have a senator in here? Is that what I'm reading? Senator Bruce Tarr. Hello. Sorry. So you might need to have a pullout for a kid who's just like flying past some topic. So it's just when we say inclusion, and Tom used to say this as well. I mean, just because we've been talking so much about Tom, I keep thinking about him. 100% is not real either. 100% is also a program. You want to give what the kids need, whether or not they have a disability. But yeah, okay. We can move over to the next.
Sasha
one.
didn't get a chance to ask her question yet.
I'm sorry, Sasha.
That's okay, Lauren, and I'll be quick. I'm trying to just kind of relate this back to families who are watching right now. And, we have a lot of work to do as a district, but between then and now, and how we're kind of thinking about things and operating. And what would you recommend families that are watching do now? So, for example, if they feel that their student is in a general education classroom and they're trying to advocate for more additional services that perhaps pull that student out because they don't have the services available to push in, or we're evaluating all these things, what should parents be doing now, and how can they discuss this with their team? And maybe Marcy wants to help with that. I feel like there's this disconnect between what we know is happening now, what parents are potentially looking for their students because it's not available currently in the general education classroom for whatever reason, and it's going to take us time to get there. So I'm not sure how to approach that, and we'd love as a SEPAC to be able to have those conversations with families.
Marcy, did you want to say something?
I mean, I think that's the great question, right? So that's part of why we started doing the process of what we're doing right now. And that's part of why we need to get together as a committee and talk about what our priorities are going to be in terms of implementation. But there is going to be a time period where we're not gonna, there are some situations in here that I want the ideals. I want the 100%. I want to look at those MCAS scores and think next year they will be equalized, but I also know that's not the reality of what's going to happen. So I think we have to continue to have that communication, and just what you all are doing, and part of this conversation is educating the families on ask the right questions. We may not have the answer that you're looking for, but continue to ask the questions and continue to ask those questions. But they're very different questions than I think some of the questions that we've been asking in the past. This elicits a whole other thought process. And to Rachel's point, a lot of what we're talking about is strengthening what's happening in the general education classroom. And what Lauren said earlier, you're right. And what Sasha, your point is, there's a lot of things that are in process right now, but they're still a little bit up here. They haven't necessarily trickled all the way down to the way that we would want them to have the impact. That impact is going to take the impact's going to be a process, and it's going to take time. So I don't think there's necessarily an easy right answer or an answer that's going to satisfy like an immediate need to say, oh, like you're walking out the door and say, listen, I want to go all in or all out. But I think we're starting the process, and the conversation needs to continue to happen. I think there's a lot of pieces in here that we're going to have to really talk about what the priorities are going to be. And I know one of those priorities are going to be strengthening our MTSS process, because right now when we're sitting down in meetings, and I said this in CPAC and we talk about it a lot, some of the concerns is that if it's not through special education, then where's it through? And so if I or anybody sitting at the team meeting can't answer that question for you, then we have a problem. But that is our only solution right now. So unfortunately, some of it's going to be continuing to do what we do while strengthening those pieces that are going to be coming up.
Just to add to that, I want to be really clear. Special ed can't fix special ed. This is a district-wide concern. The fact that it goes from 0 to 60 sometimes in a district means that the district really needs to build that MTSS model up. And that does take time, and that's really frustrating. So when I was a district leader, I would talk to parents and I would say, listen, your job is to fight for your kid. My job is to fight for the kid and the district. And sometimes that's going to put us in weird spaces. And how do we negotiate that? We have to find some relationship and some trust together to understand that this is really hard work and we need to do it together. You can't leave it just to the district, and you can't leave it just to the families, and you can't leave it just to the lawyers or the advocates. It's got to be everybody. So everybody's got to take a role and dig in. The other thing I would say in terms of families is we've given you, and I'm going to credit Ruchika for most of this, we've given you an enormous amount of resources at the end that maybe people can start learning together, and picking up some new ideas and having that other voice together, learning from each other. Another Lauren. Yay, Lauren. Go ahead.
Power of Lawrence.
Yeah.
So on that topic, and this goes back to obviously Marcy's objectives and CPAC's objective of helping to support our parents. And, I think when we look at a parent who has a child with special needs or any type of disability, you're digesting so many things at once: a diagnosis, neuropsych evaluations, and you're coming into a school situation where it's like reading a new foreign language. And on that of like, yes, we can tell parents, ask questions and do these certain things, but it's a full-time job on top of your full-time job on top of life, right? So what are some things, I guess, in practice when we talk about, you mentioned the resources at the end and learning together that, we can especially do in collaboration with Marcy as a CPAC to support our parents? Besides, we have a support group, we have our meetings, but bringing presentations, workshops, what have you seen to help educate and support those parents so that they can advocate and they know what questions to ask?
There's no one answer to your question, Lauren. So there's
Lauren,
a lot.
I need something.
I mean, other people can chime in, but one thing that you made me think about is when teams are presenting all of this complicated information, and I just read an IEP in Arizona that an evaluation. I've been in this field 40 years. I couldn't understand some of it. Now, if I can't understand some of it, there's a real problem. And so they're asking, this family brought it to me and said, I know, we just don't understand. I'm like, you shouldn't be able to understand it. I can't. I think the one thing that used to always work, in my opinion, is teams should be able to say everything they're saying to kids. If the team can explain this, whatever they're doing to a child about their learning and their understanding, then I think everybody can understand it a little better. So I've worked in the past with teams to be able to have this conversation with kids, to be able to pull that information to children. The other thing, again, is like study together as families, learn. I don't even know where I would start, honestly, but
I think one of the things too, and we've talked about this before in terms of like families feeling like they need to be experts in education and special education. Like, what other role are we setting people up to sit down on a table and to be that? When I go to the doctors, when we all, you know, when you go to your physicians or you go somewhere else, you know, and you try to educate yourself the best that you can. But the reality of it is that when you sit down at when you sit down at the table, like as a parent, there is no expectation, aside from being an expert on your own child, that you can be an expert at everything being thrown at you at one time at the table. I think where we lose people is in Lauren, you brought this up before, is oftentimes because of situations, not often, I don't want to say oftentimes, that's an exaggeration. At times, you know, when you see those team relationships at its best, they're the best, right? Because there's those trusting rapports, there's collaboration. A parent can say a parent can give input and suggestions and recommendations without team members feeling attacked. Team members can give feedback and information and data. They can give, you know, some good news, some concerning news without feeling like they're going to be attacked. So it's the art of that process and those trusting relationships, because when those relationships work, really anything is possible. When they're broken, they're the toughest ones to move forward with. So, and that's in any world. But I don't want parents to come in and feel like, ideally, I don't want parents to feel like they have to come in and be an expert on anything else but their child, because that's the job of a parent. But I do think that parents do feel like they need to be, and for fear of missing out on something, for fear of their child not getting the right thing, they're not necessarily trusting the people around the table. And that's something we have to work at. So, you know, and that's, you know, when I've always said this, when those things occur, they're the most challenging pieces, they're the most challenging cases to move forward with, because just like any other situation in your life, once that trust is broken, it's really, really hard to gain back. So, you know, I don't want, you know, that's hard. Like, just as you're saying, like, you can't be an expert at every, you can't be, you have a child with 8 services. There's no way you're going to be I'm not, you know, I'm facilitating a meeting. I'm not the experts, but I do rely on those experts on the table. And that's my hope for moving forward with this district, is that more and more parents feel that way when they're sitting down at the table. So, you know, whatever feedback that, you know, we can continue to have conversations, which I think those are some of the conversations that we've had, that those are helpful and fruitful conversations. And because we're going to make mistakes, and that's just the unfortunate reality of situations.
Sasha, did you have a question now?
I think it just would be helpful perhaps, and I may be skipping ahead, so you can tell me to wait, but this really relates to slide 111 regarding the family survey and the percentage of families who agree or strongly agree with each statement. And I just think that one of the things that Urban Collaborative pointed out, which was really important, is that 40% of families feel like they have a positive relationship with their IEP team, or 41%, whatever the number was. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about that and kind of what feedback you got during your family interviews, and if, you know, how we can address that as a CPAC and as a district, because I know that one of the challenging things is that families hold the burden of proof, not the school district. And that can be really challenging for families if they're not educated in what that burden of proof looks like or how to overcome that. And I don't know if that feeds into your number or what you found. I don't want to continue speaking for you, but maybe you could touch on that or tell me we're going to get to that.
Well, I'll just give you an overview that's not North Andover, which North Andover was similar to. When you look at families of kids with disabilities nationally and relationships with schools and school districts. Usually it's better with the teacher than the school, which is better than the district, which is better than, I mean, it's the closer you are, the better. So we did find that in the family survey. And we did also find that everybody realized that everybody needs some more support. But for the rest of it, I want to look at the slides when we're talking. So I don't want to talk out of turn. So let us get there if we can. But just to start the process, I think that's really important. And we just were really impressed by the number. Oh, that's I didn't have the slide up. It was 300, I think 315 families or family responses. And that was really impressive. So we
I think that
definitely
was, I think those were the staff, the hundred, I think
Yeah, it
it's
was 177.
117 family responses, yeah.
Thank you.
But 117 is still quite a large.
You're a small district. You're a small district. It was quite impressive. Both were impressive. Can you go back one slide? Please? No. How did that happen? Oh, you went forward one slide. Go back one slide. Back. There you go. One more. Go forward now. There you go. We are working with a three tandem teams because somehow my computer has decided that it doesn't want to charge. And I'm at 3%, which is, and it's been plugged in all day. So who knows? Anyway, in terms of our last objective, targeted professional practice, we want to make sure that everything we're talking about is built in, as professional development has built into all that we're talking about. Oh, geez, here she goes. And my headphones didn't charge either. So within these, we want to make sure that we are thinking about collaboration. Gen Ed and special ed need to collaborate. I'm sorry, Kara, can you take over for a second? I got to get the dog to stop yelling. Give me 1 second.
We also can't hear the dog, so it's okay.
Oh, you can't? Oh my God, she's so loud. All right. So with collaboration, you want to make sure that Gen Ed and special ed are talking and planning together. So if a child, and this is one of the answers to how you do this inclusive practices well, you don't put two adults in the room and leave it and call it inclusion. It's not the strongest way to do that. The best way to do that is to have these folks plan in advance. And so your professional practice needs to include intensive planning. When I was last teaching, planning was more important than me being in the gen ed classroom, because you want to make sure that you've created the environment and the lesson to be accessible to all before the teachers are actually co-teaching, and you want to plan how they're going to go teach. So collaboration is hugely important between gen ed, special ed, between the related service providers and special ed and gen ed, before you think about co-teaching. So collaboration. Everybody is responsible for all students, but that planning and the collaborative planning is huge. And then staffing. People often ask us for staffing numbers and what is the correct number. There is no such thing. There are either protocols and there's, benchmarks, etc. But you want to make sure that you are staffing to meet the needs of the children in front of you. And we did, you'll see in the report that we did a little bit of a thought experiment with teaching assistants. And I want to really clarify what we did there, so there's no misunderstanding. Teaching assistants in North Andover are potentially the best folks you have, but on paper, they're the least qualified compared to a teacher. And so right now in North Andover and in many districts across the country, teaching assistants are responsible for the education of kids with disabilities who have the most complex needs. So you want to think about that when you're staffing. You want to think about making sure that the child with the most complex needs gets the most highly qualified teacher. You want to think about the fact that you want to collaborate when you're staffing. You want to think about the fact that a lot of your speech and language services can be done in the gen ed class. It doesn't have to be these pull-out numbers. I mean, pull-out for speech and language is often good for articulation when a kid is young, but as a child gets older, you want to do more language. You want to teach that teacher. So your staffing really depends on what is special ed in North Andover. And then the last, I believe. And again, professional learning, we just want to make sure that with whatever you do, whatever the district does, that there's professional learning connected to it. Do not assume people know how to do all of this. Do not assume people know how to plan together. It's a complicated, just think of everything as complex, but people planning together, it can work beautifully. It can work really, it can be really complicated. I've been in planning. There's actually an article written about me when I was a teacher and me and a gen ed teacher and how much we fought. It was horrible. But we ended up being like the most powerful team, but it was really hard to do because everybody's got their place and they've been doing this for a long time or didn't. Anyway, so it's hard. So don't assume that people don't need support. And I would say the families as well need support. Okay, so those are the overarching, I'm just looking at the time. Those are the overarching recommendations and sub-recommendations. Okay, we're good? So what we were gonna
Lauren,
do, yeah, go ahead.
yes, as we're moving towards this different section, there's one question from Rachel in the chat. Do districts tend to create subcommittees for continued next steps and implementation of action items?
Yes. Yes, usually you've created some sort of an ownership. The work is everybody's, but there's got to be an ownership of figuring out who's doing what and when and how it's happening, and an ownership of creating. And we've given you these recommendations in a way that we believe can go right into creating a strategic plan. And then you also can't do it all. And so that group needs to figure out what's happening. You can't do it all. You have to take pieces and figure out what you can do. Get some low-hanging fruits, get some things that are more complicated to do. But that can't be Marcy's job. Marcy's one person, and it can't be special ed's job. It's got to be it's got to be bigger than that. And I say, of course, Marcy, you could do it all. That's not my point. My point is it's not fair to put
I
it on one
cannot do it
person.
all.
It's not fair to put it on one person or one department. This is a district-wide question. And again, if you do this well, if the district does it well, then everybody will benefit. And we did list at the end some ideas of next steps. And in those next steps, we talked a bit about who might be part of that. Ruchika, do you want to speak to that a drop?
Sure. So in each of the recommendations, based on our conversations with the district, one of the asks was to see which ones might be in each of the recommendations, what would be a sub-recommendation that we might think should be a priority. And we did put in our thoughts in that. And in doing that, we said things like district leadership or school leadership, so based on the sub-recommendation that we were referring to. But again, these were meant as just big ideas from us. Priority and prioritizing by your own groups is what would make the most sense.
Okay, so should we keep going? The idea was we would go into a deep dive into 2 areas. Can you just go back one slide? So the idea is that we go into deep dive into 2 areas, one in objective 1, one in objective 2, one in objective 3, and then we go into some of the data. So if that's okay to keep going, we'll do that. All right, sorry, go ahead. So I'm going to take the first one, Kara's going to take the next one. So the first one is to look a little bit deeper at your MTSS work. So go ahead. And so this is what you saw already. That our recommendation is to think of MTSS for the entire district, and the bullets down there with tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 is actually the language from the Massachusetts blueprint. And that's still the recommendation. Okay, so now we've given you what our suggested action steps, again, our recommendations are clear. The action steps are ideas, and you need to think about, are those the right ones? Do you want to do other ones? But we've given you the action steps we think are appropriate. They're a little more fluid than the recommendations and the sub-recommendations. Those are pretty clear. Not that this isn't clear, but it's more, you can make it more to the district's liking. So the first action step is to look with all of your relevant stakeholders, gen ed, special ed, district, school, teachers, community, look at all the guidance that's out there right now on MTSS and make sure you understand what it's been saying and what it needs to shift to. So get familiar with it and think about where it needs to shift and how it's going to shift. And then communicate that. I think this is going to be a big shift. Again, if this is shifted, so special ed's not tier 3 and MTSS is for everybody, you've shifted a lot in the district. So it needs to be shifted in policy and language, etc. So look at your communication plan. And then the next one, please. And then looking at your SAT team, your student assistance team, all sorts of data. They need to look at all the data from across the district, different types of data in order to make these decisions around what supports and services students need in tiers 2 and tiers 3. We're very clear, and I know the district is also clear about this, that universal design for learning really helps here. It's a way of thinking about how to teach and how kids learn. It's based on brain research on how students learn. And that's complicated. But the simplicity of it is you're going to look at 3 different areas and always plan in these 3 areas, always hit how something's represented, always hit how a child engages with something, always hit how somebody can explain what they know. And there's lots of tools around this, but it's really good teaching that should be for everybody. And then our other action step is that DCAP, use it. It's good. So we suggest that you use it. And again, every one of our recommendations and action steps going to conclude with provide professional learning opportunities. And so the next thing is we've given you supporting data for each of these sub-recommendations after the action steps, the data that led us to say this. And anything we've said in this report is not just one person saying it or one thing we found. It's a conglomeration of all of the data that we looked at. So for your supporting data for MTSS, we wanted to say that tier 1 is a strength in terms, especially as it relates to literacy in the district. Tier 2 is not well defined, and tier 3 is special ed. And we want to, we've been saying that, so you can keep going. And then with literacy, again, the core literacy programs and the work you're doing around literacy is really strong. We think your tier 1 literacy is a huge strength for a district. We're really impressed with the work we even heard about on Thursday night. I know you've been doing good work and now we're hearing more good work. So you can keep going. Oh, wait, back up 1 second. We did find that what we did find that is not great is that students in sub-separate special education programs often did not receive access to these curricula. And we want that, that's that whole thing with MTSS and access to the curriculum. They should have access to this. And even if a child has, you can have a very small number of kids who have intellectual disabilities, and even they should be building toward access to this. This is always the goal. Okay, you can go on. And there are a lot of supports. You have Wilson, you have Landmark, Outreach, Haggerty, Geodes, Hill for Literacy. You have a screening. You're doing a lot of screening. So again, more good work with your literacy. Progress monitoring. We heard on Thursday night, you're even going higher than this, but you've been using DIBELS, which is one of the national standards for a screening tool, and you're moving it up to M-Class, which is a higher level. So again, really good work. Keep going. So access to this is another one. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Okay, here it is. So when you're talking about access to high quality instruction, you need to understand that UDL can be implemented across the district. And at this point, we heard people talking about it in a good way, but we didn't see it implemented. And again, with the DCAP, we've seen it. And we know professional development has been offered, but it's not implemented across the district. Okay. And that's it for this one. So I'm going to let Carrie take over for the next one.
Okay, thank you. And as always, please let us know if you have questions as we move forward. So this is the recommendation around the least restrictive environment, which we've talked about a little bit. And the overall recommendation is to continue to define and develop effective inclusive special education supports and services that are designed to provide access to general education and specially designed instruction in the least restrictive environment. And Lauren has talked about that in a fair amount of detail about what does that mean to have access to general education and to have specially designed instruction. And so we have a couple of specific action steps, which have been sort of foreshadowed in everything that we've said earlier. The idea of developing collaborative work and this integrated comprehensive systems for equity is one way of thinking about it. And this idea of starting with co-planning, moving to co-serving, and finally to co-learning. And so that, again, as Lauren said, it is not just throwing two adults into a classroom. Really, the planning is the key part that makes co-teaching successful. The second action step is, actually, you know what, Lauren, you were going to do these after I gave the introduction.
Yes, I will.
So I'll do the data. You go ahead and do this.
So the action steps for least restrictive environment, again, is to think about that co-planning. There's a lot of work right now being done on co-planning, co-serving, meaning that everybody is responsible for all students, but that's really what we talked about earlier. And the ICS work is just one group that's doing this work, but they have a lot of good tools, which is why we put it in there. And you see C3A there. There's a lot of overlap between them. So there's a lot of connections between the different action steps we wanted to make clear. Also, you want to review what your models are now and consider with what's happening now, what supports and services that are provided in your sub-separate classes could be implemented in the gen ed class by special educators, gen ed educators, and or related service providers. A special ed service does not have to be provided by a special educator. As long as that child's getting what they need, it can be provided by whomever it makes sense to be provided by. A gen ed teacher and a special ed teacher planning could be giving the child a service. So there's a lot of ways to think about what services are provided where. And then also, you want to make sure that kids who are in sub-separate classrooms who are included in gen ed now, this is current, focus on academics right now. And this has been historically the case, where you take students with disabilities who are in sub-separate classrooms and start including them in gen ed, and we go to art, music, and gym, which for a child might be the hardest place to develop relationships. I mean, everybody's social and they've just come in out of nowhere. So don't just go to art, music, and gym. Think about academics, think about other things. You do not have to be on grade level to be in a grade that is their level. You don't, and the law actually says that you can't remove a child from a gen ed class just because they're below grade level. So you can be below grade level and be in that gen ed class and get access and specially designed instruction. Okay. And again, for your least restricted environment, you want to assure that the teachers are supporting the work of, you want to make sure that your teaching assistants and your teachers are in their appropriate roles. So you want the teachers to provide the majority of supports and services, and the teaching assistants support the work of the teachers that are supporting the students. You want to create those resources. Again, the resources that we have at the end of this document help people make educational placements and problem-solving decisions. You want to create tools to help your teams figure out how to do this work. And again, always provide professional learning opportunities to do all of this work. Okay.
So
The
now I'm gonna
supporting
jump
data.
in
Oh, go
because
ahead.
this is the data. Yep.
Yep.
And actually, if we can just go to the next slide, I already talked to you about the overall district LRE. And if we could actually click right on where it says chart 11, that should take us right to those slides. Yay. Okay. So somebody asked about what do we do as we're working on changing practices in K-5? What do we do with the students who are currently in 6-8 and 9-12? And this is another data point for you to think about in that conversation. Because when we look at least restrictive environment by grade span, what we see is that the two at the top, the dark blues, are K2 and 3-5, and there's a much larger percentage of students who are already being educated in general education. And so those are the students who we hope are getting those literacy interventions and are, if they're finding challenges, they're then getting tier 2 supports. And if they're still finding challenges, they're getting tier 3 supports. And they're in that inclusive setting, getting the specially designed instruction. It's not happening as much in grades 6 to 12. And so that is something perhaps to really think about what is happening for students, particularly I think in what's the partial inclusion. What does partial inclusion look like in grades 6 to 8 and 9 to 12? And what kind of instruction are students getting in that setting? Is that the setting where most of their academics are being provided substantially separate and they're being included in non-academic classes? So that's something to really think about in terms of trying to meet the needs of the students who are in grades 6 to 12. And also just looking at the separate schools, grades 9 to 12, the largest percentage who are in separate settings are in grades 9 to 12. So this is a place where you can begin to look in and see where is high quality instruction happening. And I'll just say one thing that we found, and I think this is particularly in the middle school and perhaps in the high school, is that when we looked at some of the data around the alt MCAS, so that is students who take the alternate MCAS, most of those students are in sub-separate classrooms. But we also found, and it was hard to parse the data exactly, but it seemed like there are some students who are in sub-separate classrooms who are not taking the alt MCAS, which means they are taking the regular MCAS. And so then that raises the question, how are they getting the grade level instruction if they are in a substantially separate classroom? So I see Rachel has her hand raised. Why don't you go ahead and ask?
I guess, thank you for reiterating that, because I know you mentioned that the other night, and then I read that. I guess I have a hard time rectifying the idea that a student that requires over 60% of their educational week outside the general education classroom is somehow also eligible to take the regular MCAS. When you look at the standards for taking an MCAS alt and all of that, it just do you have more information about that data? Because I just don't see how those two things can be together there.
So I do, but I will also say, I guess on the unfortunate aspect of it, that's probably not something we're going to be seeing moving forward because the state of Massachusetts has changed. You used to be able to take, for instance, in a sub-separate classroom, if a student was, and again, though they may not have, and I don't know the specifics, I don't have the specific student in my head, but whether or not they were accessing grade level curriculum in context of a general education classroom through their IEP, they probably were accessing more towards grade level opportunities. Again, let's just say in math in their sub-separate program. Again, you used to be able to take one of the alt MCAS and maybe not the other, but now you have to, it's an all or none situation, which is actually, I don't get, but I mean, I get, but I don't get. I think the theory behind it, Rachel, is probably exactly what you're saying. But again, those students in a manner, because it was appropriate for their goals and objectives, were getting grade level access to grade level material in a sub-separate setting. More likely than not. Because it was a lot of our students that are in our RISE program. So students that were having significant, maybe in the past communication deficits or behaviors that
I
have
was just gonna say,
some
I
act.
think
Yes,
interfering with behaviors is clearly a challenging area for integration as students get older, because we see
Mhm.
like what happens here in the numbers exactly here with a bump in separate schools and residentials being
Yeah.
on the higher end for older, which makes complete sense, right? Yeah. So
And so I suspect those numbers are
I take it
younger
with-
students.
Yeah.
Elementary age students, probably most so, who then probably, hopefully, likely are transitioning more into the classroom and more into inclusion settings. But again, that's just based on the kids that I have in my mind. But unfortunately, we're going to see less of those numbers over the next couple of years.
And so I think I would encourage you, because we're talking about specific students in these settings, to really see, like, we did not examine specific programs here. We observed schools and we observed some programs. We did not do enough observations to be able to make any generalizations about the programs. But we did not see a lot of evidence of grade level instruction happening in any of the sub-separate classrooms. So it's just something to keep in mind. Your numbers look good, but what we're trying to do, and what you asked us to do, is find the places behind the numbers where students might not be getting served as well as they could. So the next slide, chart 12, talks about, so this is where we're looking at disability category. Now, disability category, like MCAS, is a challenging variable. It's a social construction. In one district, a student will be identified with a learning disability. In another district, they will not be identified with that learning disability, or they will be identified with a different disability. And so we recognize, and the district needs to recognize, that these disability categories serve a certain purpose to help you understand the possible needs of the students. But even within any disability category, there are vast needs of those students. Autism, there's such a spectrum of student needs, and other disability categories as well. All of that said, there were some very interesting differences in terms of educational environment by disability category. And if you look at the far left set of bars, what you see is that students with developmental delay, who are ages 3 to 9, are 90% included, which is fabulous. And then in addition, specific learning disabilities, health, communication, all of those have high levels of inclusion. And where you begin to see less inclusion is around emotional disabilities, autism, and intellectual disabilities. And in particular, the substantially separate classrooms of students with autism and intellectual disabilities, we encourage you to examine that carefully, and just again to remember the research that there is not research that demonstrates that those are necessarily the best settings for students. Now, for every student, you have to look at their individual needs, but it's important when you start seeing these trends to say, okay, let's take a look at this and think about it. Okay, so next slide. This is looking at. We decided that given these interesting patterns with disability category, we wanted to see, is that also happening across the state and across the country? And we saw a few things that are similar. First, those high levels of autism, low levels of inclusion among students with autism is also happening across the state and across the country. That doesn't mean that it's good. It just means that you're in a similar boat as the state and the country. Communication. The North Andover in the state is below the federal, and with emotional disabilities, you're doing a little bit better, as with health and with specific learning disabilities. Last week, we had a conversation about the situation with students with intellectual disabilities. Those students who are identified with intellectual disabilities, none of them are being educated in a fully inclusive environment, but at the state and national level, they are. There is also a much lower identification of students with intellectual disabilities in North Andover than in the state. So those two things are interrelated. You have fewer students who are identified, and those students who are identified are in substantially separate classrooms. So it's worth investigating what are your identification practices around intellectual disabilities that are similar to or perhaps different from the state. So those are the things around least restricted environment. And then one more, again, the North Andover is a small district, and so we want to look at all of these smaller groups with great caution. But it is interesting to note that among the African American students, only 51% are in fully included environments, and that's much lower than the state or the country. In some of the other categories, North Andover is doing better. So again, you don't say that there are significant differences, that these have statistical value, but you look at these as patterns and say, let's take a look and see what's happening around our identification practices, around how we're deciding IEPs, and are there patterns that we can think about maybe doing a little bit differently? Rachel.
Thank you so much. And I think moving forward, obviously, once you see the data, we pay more attention to the challenge, right?
Right.
How do we support families? And Marcy, maybe this is a better question for you. How do we rectify this almost immediately? For me, like, this is a glaring component here for data, and for our Black and African American families seeking support. This data is scary data, I would think. How is this something? This is not a wait and see, right? This is not it will take years. This is not a change from UDL. This is very glaring data, and it may only be a small percentage. How do we address this, Marcy, in the more immediate future, like right now for our Black and African American students?
I'm on mute. Sorry. We have to look to see what the numbers are too, and the distribution around the district as well. That would be a curious point. I had spoken at the last meeting. For years we had, because it hasn't come up, which I think I've talked about areas of significant disproportionality. So the state flags us. Again, I'm not looking to wait to the state flag anything. I'm not waiting I'm not settling on the state standard. But what has come up an area for us as in significant disproportionality in the past is over-identification. So for parents to know, like, all of our identification practices have to be sent into the state. So this is information that came from the state, right? So they know who we're qualifying, the demographics of the students, the disability categories, the backgrounds, the educational environment, and then they will send us updated information. So in years past, outside of the last, I think it was ended last year, we did have an area of significant disproportionality in the area of overqualification of Hispanic and Latino students as intellectually impaired. But as Carrie was saying, we have such small numbers in North Andover that equated to 5 students. And so this is an example of how we address this, and Rachel, similar things that we look at. In special education, this is again food for thought for us, because we don't take as deep of a dive into the data on a regular level as we should. So the reality of it is that when we looked at that situation, one of the things that we rectified noticed pretty early on is that students, and this wasn't a North Andover issue, oftentimes in the students that we looked at, they weren't initially qualified in North Andover, and the consistent thing that was missing in their evaluations was adaptive testing. So, which is adaptive testing when you're identifying a student with an intellectual disability, you would want to have, that is skills, a set of skills that you would want to know that was impactful to be able to qualify them as that, with that disability. So we worked with our school psychologist to ensure that moving forward, and again, so we don't have that qualification anymore, but we would use a similar practice. And again, it is quite easy. It is easier to look at when we look at the numbers in terms of buildings, because it will be a small amount of students. So we should be able to get a dive into those numbers relatively quickly and make some decisions around that. But honestly, I think a lot of it's going to tie into what we've already talked about in terms of our other levels of support. So my initial question would be, what levels of support did they receive? And this will be for all students prior to receiving special education services. So that would be one big question that I would ask when looking at any of this data.
And we're going to move on to looking at the family survey, but let me just say one more thing around the graduation data, which we won't look at. The graduation rate is actually really impressive for both students with disabilities and students without disabilities across the district. But when you look at the students who did drop out, the percentage of those students who are Latino is distressingly high. A very small number of students, but you see some of these patterns of here you see a concentration of Latino students, here you see a concentration of Black students. And so it's constant vigilance to make sure that you're looking at those numbers and making sure that there are not unexamined biases that are happening, that are that obviously that happen around the country, because this is an issue that continues to happen. But I just want to make sure that that North Andover continues to keep that in mind. And now I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Ruchika, who's going to talk about the family survey results, because we were asked to talk specifically about that.
Yes, 1 minute. There we go. So I think Lauren mentioned this, and I think either Sasha or Rachel mentioned about the family survey results that you had looked at it. It is similar to what Lauren said as a national trend. It looks like the 117 families that reported, 58% of those families did report feeling much more, having a more positive and a collaborative relationship with their general education teachers, with their classroom teachers. Sorry. And then, like you, I think it was Sasha who flagged this concern about the 44% of those families said that they had a positive and collaborative relationship with their child's IEP teams. We also found that not noteworthy and an area that we know that needs to be, and we added that in our recommendations as an area where development needs to happen, where learning needs to happen, so that we can build that trust. We all talked about that earlier today. I also wanted to point out the information that was stated in the survey around families having a harder time. 43% of families that did fill out the survey about finding the resources that they needed to be able to understand what their rights might be around special ed services, just information about special ed services and procedures and protocols around that. And again, talking about the resources that we shared later in the presentation, and I'll go to those just so that we're mindful of the time. But all of these resources are resources that can be shared with families. They're all resources that are not necessarily connected to a specific organization, though if they are organizations that are in these resources, we mention that. So they might require North Andover to connect with them to be able to use their resources. But most of the other resources, books, articles, are things that once you've had those conversations about priorities, once you've decided what your action steps would be, which ones you're going to be taking, and who's going to be responsible for what part of the report, there might be book discussions, article discussions, group discussions that teachers, families, administrators come together to look at and make meaning of before embarking on the next steps that you decide are going to be the steps that you take as a district. So again, their websites, each of the not each of the action steps, but each of the sub recommendations, we try to embed as many different types of resources. I just wanted to, somebody was talking about student-led IEPs, and I did not add that in the resources, but there's this text that is extremely easy to read with students, with families, with staff, and might be one that you might want to take on and read as a district, as a part of a book discussion or a group. And again, if anybody has any questions about the resources, reach out to us, or obviously anything in the report, so that we can help you with additional resources if necessary.
There's one question in the chat, and Sasha has her hand raised. The question from Zora asking specifically about the chart 16 data from the families. if we can highlight where these data fit into the specific recommendations and action steps.
Okay, let me go back.
And
so
then
that we're all
I want
looking
to
at it.
note the time too, because we have,
Yeah. Okay, so sorry, you were saying that where is this included in the action steps? The
Yes.
action steps, perfect. The action steps where we talk about communication and collaboration between, I don't remember the exact action step that was connected with it. We talk about collaboration with families and clearer communication protocols. We talk about the standard operating procedures manual as a venue, as a place for some of these policies and practices to be clearly stated, so that families have a way to be able to understand where to go and who to communicate with when necessary. And there was another question, I think, Carrie, you said?
Sasha has hand raised.
Okay, Sasha?
I just want to make sure that we also are answering the questions that are in the chat and were submitted via the Google form. So one of the things that I think, if I may, relates to this and to families is, one says, can you comment on the idea of effective progress? Our understanding as a parent with a child on an IEP is essentially that a child making progress against oneself is still considered effective. This doesn't help children close the gap with peers. Can you please address this idea of equitable, effective progress? And the reason why I hoping to just fit these in somehow, but with this is really just because families not feeling like they have a strong relationship or a positive relationship with their team, again, holding that burden of proof. How can they talk about effective progress? How can they understand effective progress and communicate that with their team? Because when teams and families are on the same page, things go a bit smoother.
I mean, that's the whole creation of goals and objectives in an IEP, is having that conversation of what is effective progress. That's one way. And then the state giving you that year benchmark is another way. But I don't know how else to answer that except reach for the stars. People should be pushing for their kids to go to the highest absolute standard that's humanly possible with presumed competence. There's a concept we put in here called presumed competence, that you want to presume that a child can do more than you can actually see and raise those standards as high as you can. And the higher standards, usually the more they'll go. The higher, the more progress somebody will make, maybe not to that. So the standards being high, I don't know, Ruchika, Carrie, you want to add more to that?
Not necessarily. I think in that conversation with the IEP teams, and again, going back to, I think what Mercy was saying earlier around trust and having that conversation with your team about what does effective progress mean for each child, connected with each of those skills that you're working on as IEP goals, breaking it down for the families, for the students to be able to, and that's why the student-centered IEP conversation is really important. Right? I mean, for students to be able to understand what their objectives are, what those benchmarks are, so that they can speak to it. And then similarly, the families can, so that everybody's clear on what that effective progress does mean. Because it can be just a term that people use, and how it then connects with the grade level standards. And I know that you all, Marcy, I know that you had talked about standard-based IEP work that you're doing, and goals and objectives around that. So that would be work that would be something that families should need to also be a part of, so that they can understand and be a part of their professional learning.
And the other pieces is that, the standard in Massachusetts is that goals need to be reasonably calculated to ensure that there is progress being made. So that means that at any time, like during that period, if you feel like they're going to way exceed or never going to make that team would reconvene. But the other piece that we have stressed, and I have stressed, and teams have that is stressed in the building, is that you need to see it. It needs to be shown to you through the collection of data, and that's data not just by the special education teacher, but data throughout the school day. So that is what's happening in the general education classroom too. Teachers use data to inform their instruction, and oftentimes it's hard to translate that data into kind of a day-to-day quick understanding. But those conversations, and again, I feel like we are in a much different place in terms of the expectation around providing meaningful data to families around progress monitoring, both general education and special education.
That's our presentation. You guys have asked some great questions. Are there more questions? And we are running over, and I can't run too far over because I have a niece in the airplane right now coming to land, and I have to go pick her up at the airport. So, but are there other, Rachel?
I mean, I guess maybe another thing we can do is leave the question and answer box open and submit those in for a little bit and resubmit that.
Just like logistical questions, just do you stay on Urban Collaborative now with the district and provide that ongoing consultation, or is this where kind of your component ends?
That's part of the discussion we have in terms, so they have no more commitment with us, but that's part of the discussion that we'll have in terms of formulating a committee and next steps, technical assistance.
Do we know if that's on like the agenda for school committee? Is that?
So I mean, I've already said that the formulation of a committee is necessary in terms of unpacking this. So I'm not sure what that, in terms of the a school committee or whatever, but that's a discussion that we'll have. But in terms of,
it's so much bigger than just you, Marcy. Like it, and we've said this before. I think as CPAC, like
the committee wouldn't be, it wouldn't be special ed. No, and that's not what the committee would be. The committee would be teachers, gen ed, special ed, families, community, like it would be a cross section of people who would be needed to kind of to digest this and go through it. Like I said, we just all received it. Teachers are going over it. Are going over it in the presentation in PD tomorrow. So we are definitely at the beginning stages. So again, the formalities of school committee is not my area of expertise, but we'll find out about that.
So what are the next steps for, so I know the Urban Collaborative team has a hard stop, so we'll need to end, but for us, so there's a list of questions that, did not get addressed. I know there's from this, I think a lot more discussion and questions. We probably could go for another 2 hours. So how should we collect that? Should we collect that and provide that to you, Marcy? And then you can.
What we can do is we can keep that open. We can resubmit it. Again, the presentation just went up, so people are going to over the next few weeks have more access to it if they want it. So we can leave that up because I do want to do a similar forum for teachers, have an opportunity to have the same sort of question and answer. So there'll be some continuation. Again, we're still in the days just after, so we haven't ironed out the details, but I would think it as a starting point to leave that form open. And maybe midweek next week, we can refresh a letter to go out to families and we can connect.
Okay. And then in terms of, I think that sounds good. In terms of the presentation, I know I'd asked Marcy if there was like a PowerPoint format where you could toggle back and forth. And also if we can get access to the supporting data that was used to kind of produce it. I don't know if that's public or how that's working, or like the disaggregated data that was utilized to form your recommendations. Does that exist?
Yeah, we can't share that. That's not for us to share. We have a agreement with the district to have student identifiable data.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you want to, we can talk more specifically. There's obviously data that's available in different ways through DESE and through the security portal, but it's not oftentimes it's student data. So there's confidentiality aspects around it. But if there are specific questions that you have, we can talk more about it because there might be pieces that I can get to you.
Great. Thank
you. Thank you for letting me have tech issues too. I appreciate that nobody blinked. But you're all amazing. I loved your questions. We also feel really honored to have worked with your district, and you are such an involved family group. So we really, really honor you for that.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate everyone who came tonight. I know it's very busy, and thank you so much to Urban Collaborative and their team for all this work, and Marcy. And we appreciate everyone tonight. Thank you.